Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Hodges. I'm one of the hosts at the OSA Con, and it's my pleasure to introduce our talk from DBT Labs and Lightdash. We have a couple of great presenters. Let me give you a very brief overview. So we have Katie Hindson, who is head of product and data at Lightdash. We also have Amy Chen, who works for DBT Labs and is a partner engineer there. Amy and Katie have been collaborating on this talk, which is entitled How Open Source Enables Innovation, a case study with DBT and Lightdash. So Katie and Amy, take it away.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we are going to be discussing a topic that's very near and dear to my own heart, which is open source analytics tooling. We are speaking about it with the framework of a case study with DBT and Lightdash. And because I always like knowing where I am in a talk, I'm going to share a quick agenda. We're going to have a brief overview of what DBT and Lightdash are, the standards that allow us to innovate in this crazy analytics ecosystem, and we're going to provide a quick demo. Along the way, I really want to welcome you to join the conversation, ask questions. Please do not validate my mother's viewpoint that I talk too much. So jumping right into it, let's do introductions. So as Robert kindly mentioned, I'm Amy Chen. I'm the senior partner engineer at DBT Labs. We are the creators and maintainers of an open source transformation framework called DBT. I've spent the last few years implementing DBT at many a company's modern data stack, and now I advise and educate technology and consulting partners about DBT and best practices.
And I'm Katie. I do product and data things at Lightdash, which is an open source BI tool built on top of your DBT project. Let's see if this slide stuff works now. Oh, perfect. So yeah, we're going to talk a bit about the principles in open source software that drive innovation. And we've kind of broken this out into two very ominous sounding parts, the mindset and then the process. So Amy's going to chat through some of the principles that feed into this knowledge sharing mindset and how we think this enables technical innovation. And then I'm going to chat through some of the principles that are more around sort of the process of developing open source software and how this enables, well, you can guess it, technical innovation. Go for it.
So now you might be curious what DBT is. Maybe you've heard about it in passing, or you might be sitting in your chair right now thinking that we're about to talk about a therapy method and you're very confused how it relates to open source. Don't worry, we get those questions a lot too. But before we start talking about what the tool actually does, I wanted to speak about the mindset that feeds its creation, because it really touches upon that viewpoint we have about open source and how open source tooling should work. The overall intent of DBT is to inspire collaboration. We really wanted to create one space that folks from across the data team and org can essentially meet to collaborate. We chose SQL as our chosen language because it's an accessible language that most folks are already skilled in. We also wanted to give folks a very thoughtful development process, and that's why we incorporated software engineering's best practices into the features of our tool. This essentially means that we've created a tool that's easy to interact with, provides version control, automate testing, and just things that are traditionally not part of an analyst skill set. What's really fascinating is by giving folks this easy ramp into Git and version control for their analytics workflow, we've essentially created a new set of users that can contribute to open source tooling, specifically analytics tooling that might never have otherwise. And these folks are the experts at their company. They know what their company needs from the data that they have. So with open source, we've essentially given them a platform to speak about what they want from their tooling and the ability to shape that said tooling. And it probably doesn't come as a surprise, but when you give experts the platform, you get to benefit from maintaining a tool that is truly an industry standard. That's not our marketing team speaking. We have over 19,000 folks in our Slack community. We have about 7,000 companies using DBT and over 2,000 paying customers. So zooming back out, how DBT actually works is we orchestrate your data pipelines inside of your data platforms such as Snowflake or ClickHouse. This essentially means what DBT is doing is it's parsing and compiling your SQL code that is already written in Git, and we send it over to the data warehouse to execute. We don't move data around, we're just using the compute capabilities of the platform itself. How folks are generally using it is they're using dbt to frame up their SQL queries. It allows you to essentially transform raw data into transform objects into downstream processes like that will feed into BI tools like Lightdash. This framework is meant to create trusted pipelines that are tested and documented.
Cool. Yeah. So switching gears to Lightdash. Lightdash is this open source BI tool that, oh, was that you, Amy? Sorry. That enables self-serve analytics for your DBT project. So yeah, with Lightdash, you just connect to your DBT project, and then you actually add your metrics directly into your DBT project, your data transformation layer really, and then you create and share your insights in Lightdash. Oh, sorry, sneak preview. Yeah, so in Lightdash, you have this curated set of metrics and dimensions that lets you cut your data in a bunch of different ways. So we're set up similarly to Looker in that we have this sort of semantic layer approach, or you have, your metrics and dimensions defined and curated in your transformation layer. So we're built on DBT, so we're transform layer native, and you just connect Lightdash to your DBT project, and all of the dimensions and models that you actually have in your project are immediately available to you in Lightdash. Now, because we're built on this sort of transform layer, we're able to pull in tons of super rich metadata from your transformation layer and add it into Lightdash. So this helps you really build trust in your data. We have the ability to pull in things like the data freshness or, data integrity and whether or not tests are failing. And we're also just able to sort of pull this context through to give you an understanding of the state of your analytics layer. And the last thing is, as I've mentioned, you write all of your metrics and dimensions in DBT. So you're able to keep all of your business logic in one place and give you a single source of truth for your dimensions and metrics.
So now that you have an understanding of our tools, let's dig into that mindset and process that we mentioned earlier. These are the principles that really guide our open source success and frankly should be the standard for any open source analytics tool. The mindset of our community is really about pushing knowledge, sharing to the forefront. So we really want to create a developer-driven community where we are prioritizing the voices of developers over any vendors and actually just giving folks an environment where they feel really comfortable to ask questions, offer feedback, and just help define what an industry standard should be rather than be told what it is. We'll definitely go into the specifics of documentation, Slack, and our development process later. And in terms of technical enablement, Katie will cover how we've been able to create workflows that enable approvable contribution and supporting third-party application integrations very easily. This creates a very thriving ecosystem and validates DBT as an industry standard. So let me dive right into contributions. When I say knowledge sharing is the mindset of DBT, this often plays out in very different ways. One of which is our Slack community. Our fun fact is that we actually had a community team well before we ever had a marketing team. And to quote our CEO, community is the heart of DBT. In terms of Slack, this is where we have a lot of our conversations. You'll find channels related to all things DBT and the greater analytics ecosystem. Folks will ask questions about best practices, how to use things, create productive data teams. And we also provide product updates and seek product feedback in our Slack community. But the key element that I wanted to pull from in terms of our Slack community is our push for transparency. So we really want to make sure folks can easily join the conversation and add in their own piece. And this often happens by having a very structured conversation. We heavily push threads and we push folks to converse in public channels rather than DMs. What happens when you do this is folks essentially use our Slack as a reference point. They'll often go back to past answers to educate themselves and set up new dialogue about DBT features or their own pain points about analytics. To this end, you can't really have a developer-driven product without getting feedback from users. So what better way than to provide a very public forum that has a very easy, accessible on-ramp where folks are speaking about the ecosystem and not just about your tooling. The next part is documentation. So Slack is not the only place folks are referencing about best practices. Our doc sites is actually one of our most trafficked web properties. Now, I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here. Documentation is obviously very important and hard to keep up to date. So that's actually one of the reasons why we rely on our community to assist with that. The site is open source, it's version controlled, and it's also set up in a way that folks can open up a pull request without needing to know Git to help us correct and update our doc site. And this often helps us maintain this massive doc site that also caters to beginners and advanced users. Now, there's lots of different ways to contribute to our product, and one of which is through packages. So packages in our world is essentially the SQL version of a Python library. Basically, if you have a very useful function, which we call macros, or you have modeling that you've already done, you can create a DBT project, put the code in there, and then just share it publicly with the community. Users will take that package and install it into their own projects and use that code as if it was their own. We have packages that help you test, like our DBT expectations package, which is built after the Great Expectations open source project. We also have packages that help you do standard cleanup work, like Fivetran has created some great packages for SaaS data sets like Salesforce. The idea here is to help folks get up and running with their project without having to spend a lot of time solving analytics problems like other folks have already done. And it's much like a software engineering workflow, but catered to an analyst. The key aspect that I want to pull out about packages is the idea that this code shared is just SQL. There aren't that many products out there that allow SQL users to come together and solve problems that are so common and then just apply them. Outside of, I'm sure all of you have emailed code to each other and regretted that quite a bit. Now, the last part of how our community contributes to our product is through integrations. So integrating with DBT often comes in two flavors. One is DBT Core, that's our open source product, and that often means they're creating adapters to enable DBT to run on their own data warehouse or data lake. It also could mean that you're consuming the DBT project, whether through the repository or the metadata that DBT generates per run to feed into your own product's capabilities and knowledge. That way you always know what's happening in the transformation layer before it gets to you. And this also could mean integrating with DBT Cloud, which is our SaaS product. It has an API that's fully open for you to pull metadata in or administrate your DBT pipelines.
Cool. So yeah, we've talked a whole bunch about sort of the mindset that drives innovation in open source projects, but I'm going to talk a bit more about the process of developing an open source software and really just sort of focus on the technical enablements of open source software and how this drives innovation. Sometimes my keyboard likes using my screen, sometimes it doesn't. It's sort of tricky here, but yeah, so the first principle I'm going to talk about is how open source software is modifiable, extensible, and reusable. It's sort of like the ultimate set of Lego blocks when it comes to extending and modifying code. So to give you an example of what I mean by this, Lightdash was actually sort of started by extending on the meta key in DBT. So because we have access to the source code of DBT, someone from Meltano, shout outs to Taylor Murphy, was able to extend the functionality of the YAML files in DBT to include this meta key, which is sort of like this configurable arbitrary key in the schema.yaml to enhance documents. Then at Lightdash, we immediately got to benefit from this contribution that Taylor made, and we could actually extend this meta key and use it to create key components like metrics and table joins in Lightdash. Now, having code that's like modifiable, extensible, and reusable is great. And if we have source to all of the sort of like access to all of the source code, then it makes it way easier to contribute and get the context that you need to be able to contribute. But as the code base grows and the system becomes more complex, I'm sure we've all had this feeling of overwhelming sort of code amounts. And it can become really hard to sort of modify or extend open source software. And that's one of the things that DBT has actually built to allow for their software to be modifiable, extensible, and reusable, is they've had this entire Git process built around contributions. So Amy actually spent some time interviewing package maintainers, and she talked to me a bit about it. And she heard a lot about how, you know, responding to issues from open source can also be a key stumbling block for contributions in both maintenance and innovation. So like being open source alone isn't enough to make a really extensible product. You also have to have these practices in place that you help to give other contributors the chance to develop and innovate and feel empowered to innovate with your product. The second principle I'm going to talk about is that open source software creates platforms for third-party apps. So by giving access to the software, you're obviously like encouraging sort of this ecosystem of third-party apps to be built on top of it. But the thing is, with proprietary software, you'd be at a way higher risk of building a company on top of this kind of software, because if anything happens to the software you've built on top of, you no longer have the software that's the platform for your product or application. So open source makes this kind of like a more reliable thing to build a company on top of. Again, we talked about, you know, the modifiability, extensibility, and reusability. That's never gets easier to say, by the way, of software, and how in open source software, this sort of makes it perfect foundation for rapid innovation, because it gives people the freedom that they need to tailor the software to, you know, meet specific user needs. And DBT is a special example of how they're sort of pushing this new standard for analytics engineering, and it happens to be open source. So it means it's driving this explosion of new applications that rely on some sort of standard for analytics engineering to be able to work. And we can think of profound impacts that some other open source softwares have had in enabling these third-party apps by creating this new open source standard. So things like Kubernetes, which helped companies to run their software on cloud services, or, you know, Docker for containerization of applications. These are examples of sort of the kinds of explosions of software that you can get by building open source standards and open source applications that allow for this foundation. And just to give you like a visual sense of these impacts, the image in this slide is actually about 10% of the Kubernetes certified service provider apps. So these are companies whose sole purpose is literally to just provide service for Kubernetes users. So you can imagine how big the landscape of companies are that actually use Kubernetes to power some parts of their app. Yeah, and then the third and final principle that I'm going to talk about here is how open source development enables tech to stay more relevant over time. Yeah, so the first thing is by sort of promoting a meritocracy of ideas, you're able to get an input from a really diverse group of people with a diverse set of problems, and you're continuously building the most relevant and sort of the best ones. So DBT actually talks about this approach as strong opinions loosely held. Thank you, Amy, for that quote. And you may not get this type of diverse and innovative input if you're not open source. Maybe you can, you've managed to hire this like insanely sort of diversity of thought in your company, but a lot of the time actually being open source enables this in a way that you wouldn't get in a closed source company. And then by allowing people to collaborate on these projects, you're able to actually like get rid of redundant efforts. And, you know, if two people have the same idea, then they won't have to try to build it twice. And you're able to create space for the best people to collaborate on the same project who otherwise may not have had the opportunity to work together. The other thing is, because by building something that's open source, it means that you have maybe other companies that are building on top of your platform as their product. And so your product will become stronger and more robust as the community finds different uses for it. So as the needs change, or, you know, new innovations come into the mix, then open source projects can actually stay relevant, because the mix of community members using it allows for the project to, you know, develop and adapt at the same speed of those new needs and innovations. Yeah, and that's the last of my principles. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy, who will hopefully walk you through a quick demo.
Yeah, so starting out with what this interface you're seeing in front of you is. So this is our dbt Cloud IDE. It's part of that SaaS tool that I mentioned earlier. This is where a user could come in here, work on their dbt project. It's connected to your Git repository as well as your data warehouse. You can also access our tool through the command line, but this is a much prettier interface for me to show. So what I'm going to show you is how a user will create an object in dbt, execute it, and then port it over to Lightdash. So here a user will create a SQL file. They'll write their usual just a SQL select statement. You can also add in what we call a ref function, which is a way to tell dbt how a model relates to another model, and then we can automatically create the lineage that you see below here. But at the end of the day, it's just SQL, where we just need you to write the with state, the SQL select statement, and then when you go ahead and execute the object, here I just typed in dbt run and the exact model that I wanted dbt to run. What dbt will do is tell me that it successfully created that object inside of my warehouse. In order to do that, what it did was essentially take my select statement, as you can see here, replace all of the ref functions with the actual database object. And then the key part here is the fact that it also wrote the DDL and DML for me. That way I can focus on the select statement and not have to think about, oh, is this the right DDL for me to create this object in my warehouse? So after executing and creating the object inside of my warehouse, I can go into my YAML file. This is where we apply descriptions and tests to our objects. It is also where the meta field exists, which is what Lightdash is feeding off of. So we will declare the meta fields, and then we will supply in the metrics that we want to define. In this case, we have a dimension called unique customer count. We told Lightdash what kind of type it is, and then we also added in a description field. So when a user goes into Lightdash, they'll see, let me quickly, you'll click into this object, you can see the metric that we defined, and then you can also select another metric, another dimension that they want. You can run the query.
Let's hope they're all ones, Amy.
Oh goodness, I hope so too. It should only be one unique.
A very interesting query for everyone.
And as you can see here, you can choose your different visualizations. What's also cool is you can see the description fields that we filled out, and you can see that lineage from dbt over to Lightdash. Anything else you want to call out, Katie?
No, that's about it. Yeah, so Lightdash is connected right to your dbt project. And anytime you sync your dbt project or update your dbt project, you just refresh dbt in Lightdash, and then it pulls in all those changes. And it means you can, you know, visualize your dbt project really effectively. So no more copying descriptions or things like that, or remembering model names.
Yeah, it's just part of your workflow. Basically, you define your dbt objects and then you define your Lightdash objects, and yeah, it's all version controlled together. It's I know in my workflow right now, because we also use Looker internally, where currently we have in our pull request template, remember to update Looker on the same side.
Classic.
Cool. So that ends our demo and talk. Feel free to chat with us in dbt Slack. We have a channel specifically called tools.lightdash. And also you can find out more about our tools in lightdash.com and getdbt.com.
Yeah, and there's a special site for skipping the queue for Lightdash Cloud if you're interested.
Awesome. Wonderful talk, Katie and Amy. I love that quote, strong opinions loosely held. I've got that one noted down. I already tweeted it out. A quick question for you. By the way, we have 3 minutes to go. If people want to queue up any questions for our speakers, have at it. Quick question for you though. You measure community based on the Slack channel. I think you mentioned you have 19,000 members, Amy.
Yes.
How do you think though, because your community is actually broader than that, because you have all these people building adapters, what is the real size of the community that you're dealing with?
Oh goodness, I don't think we can actually answer that question, but you're completely right. We're actually having this huge conversation internally right now about like what community means, because our community could mean the folks who are our clients, because some of them aren't in our Slack community. Obviously, there's a lot of great conversations on Twitter. We also have a podcast, which is called the Analytics Engineering Podcast. We also have a newsletter. So all of those subscribers, all of those people are touching upon our community, and we count them as our own. It's just hard to really know like who is everybody and where are you.
Yeah, it is just astounding how many people are in this. So one of the things I did when I was setting up these talks was I went and looked at, joined various communities, and certainly your Slack channel is by far the largest of anybody at this conference. It's really amazing. And Katie, you said that was a big factor in how in your decision, it sounded like to build on DBT, that you have this community, open source software, and this big broad community supporting it. So it sounds like that was a big part of your decision to go with it.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually a DBT user at my previous company, Monzo. You'll find me in like DBT marketing videos. They actually came to our office, and I was like massive DBT proponent. So I was part of the community kind of before. And yeah, it was a huge, I mean, we built Lightdash with a lot of the DBT community because we were frustrated with how sort of BI tools weren't integrated with the modern data stack. And it just felt really clanky. So we've been really lucky to build with such awesome people in the analytics community, which is mainly in DBT's Slack community and just general community.
Great, thank you. We're coming up on the bottom of the hour. We did have a question here about how to get to the DBT Slack channel. It's tools-light-dash. And I'll just read this out in case people didn't see it. We've been using DBT intensively and are super happy with how much it has simplified our analytics infrastructure. So I want to thank you both for an awesome talk. We'll go ahead and close up, let people go to the next talk in the conference. And thanks again for presenting. It's been wonderful having you today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay,
Enjoy the
bye-bye.
rest. Bye.
Bye.